Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christina Langell. With me today is our Northeast Regional Editor, Kristen Smith. And Kristen, you got to write a little bit about two different states this week when our neighbors to the east, New Jersey, had their gubernatorial candidates commenting on Josh Shapiro as a sort of aspirational governorship to look towards for motivation and how one governs in a moderate fashion. What are your thoughts on that, or what were the thoughts that you heard about this?
Right. So this was a really funny article from the perspective of a state government reporter. How this came about is that over the weekend, I stumbled across an article from Politico that was talking to the GOP gubernatorial candidate in New Jersey, Jack Ciattarelli, I think is how you say it, but I apologize if that's not how it's said. And he was really admiring Shapiro as being this centrist figure who can work with divided government. Shapiro loves to talk about how he's the only state in the country with a divided legislature. And he really prides himself on the things that he's able to get done as a result. And that seems to really stick out to the GOP candidate in New Jersey. He even said, Pennsylvania doesn't have an energy crisis. Pennsylvania's business taxes are really great. They're attracting new business. Again, this is something that as a state government reporter who has been listening to Republicans and Democrats in the state for 15 years now, that feels gaslighting a little bit, at least if you are someone who doesn't agree with Shapiro or the Democrats who control the House right now. And so given that, I decided that I would reach out to the highest ranking Republican in the state, Kim Ward, and ask her what she thought about Ciattarelli's comments and his perception of Shapiro and how that seemed so vastly different than the perception of Shapiro inside the state. And she had some thoughts, as one can imagine. The first thing that really stood out to her is that she thinks the centrism that Josh Shapiro has is because he has to work with Republicans. She argues that if he didn't have to, that he would skew far more left and progressive on the policies that he supported, in large part because he wants to run for president in 2028. And so it would behoove him to be more, at least from their perspective, to be more openly Democratic instead of this centrist figure that he's had to be in Pennsylvania. And that's also interesting because in New Jersey, the current governor there, Phil Murphy, has very famously said that he wants to make New Jersey the California of the East. And from Kim Ward's perspective, she thinks that if it weren't for Senate Republicans to rein him in, to bring him to the table, say on corporate net income taxes, that he'd make Pennsylvania the California of the East, which is a really interesting thought, but there's not really a way to prove or disprove it because this is going to be our legislature at least through probably until 2028.
It's an interesting thought too, because I don't think that most progressives would really put Shapiro in the camp of a left-leaning Democrat. I think they would put him. I'd love to hear what you've heard from Democrats, but my observation is, he's not typically thrown in there with like Bernie Sanders or AOC as having these radically, pro-socialist policies. He does seem, to the New Jerseyan and perhaps to the average Democrat, maybe he seems fairly centrist. What have you heard in that regard?
I think that's interesting. It's interesting because I think that is the overwhelming thought about him, and that, he was even up for consideration for Kamala Ward's running mate back in last year, and he was not recognized then as someone who was particularly progressive. In fact, he was thought as an asset because he was a popular governor in a very key swing state. And so you actually got to ask Representative Smith Wade L about, what did he think about what, New Jersey had to say about Governor Shapiro's centrism and the state's ability to work together on this divided government. And he most notably laughed, but said that he thinks there's a lot to admire about the way Pennsylvania government runs itself, but they don't always get things right. But, he's still pretty optimistic. He said that essentially he could understand why a state might want to emulate what Pennsylvania does. I also think it's interesting too, because it's funny, if you look at it, New Jersey looks at Pennsylvania as so centrist and someone who's really doing it right, especially on taxes and energy. But then you turn and listen to Governor Shapiro, who has very famously said over and over that we need to stop losing to friggin' Ohio, as he puts it. And so he turns his eye to the West to say we should be more like them, particularly with our business taxes and attracting businesses to the state. So it's just funny to me how that lines up. They're all just kind of like looking to each other to decide to say, oh, this person's doing it better than we are. And again, it kind of undercuts the idea that he would be some far left progressive, because Ohio is Republican controlled and they definitely, their policies reflect that. But at the same time, to say that Pennsylvania doesn't have an energy crisis is quite, it almost feels like he hasn't been reading the news coverage out of here, because although we have bountiful sources of energy, we have a lot of data centers coming in. We don't have enough energy to power those. We're also the state that provides the most power for all of the power grid in PJM, which includes New Jersey. We're a big part of why prices are still affordable, because we have so much energy here that we're able to send out. And so technically we don't have an energy available. We don't have a crisis in the sense that there is no energy. We just have a crisis of there's not enough, and we're struggling to meet our renewable energy goals, and we're growing too fast in certain areas, such as data centers, to keep up with demand. And that's going to make prices go up. So, and Shapiro has been on record about, he's an all above energy governor, but he's not against, carbon limiting pollution programs that would effectively raise prices on fossil fuel producers, which they play an important role right now in keeping prices low. So definitely there's a much clearer delineation there of what makes Shapiro more quote unquote progressive versus Republicans. But again, it was a very interesting juxtaposition between how New Jersey views us and how Pennsylvania views itself.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. And I should clarify that Rep. Smith-Waddell laughed at the idea of Pennsylvania being cooperative right at this moment because of our current impasse. He wasn't laughing so much at Governor Shapiro. But I do think it speaks to that if you do have these presidential aspirations, is it possible? I mean, and this has a lot to do with, I guess, the current breakdown of society, if you want to call it that. Is it possible to mediate between these two groups? Is it a failure on Shapiro's part that the Republicans and Democrats in Pennsylvania are struggling so much to get it together? And would you similarly cast that sort of responsibility on a president who's undoubtedly going to have to be dealing with two parties that are very seriously not getting along lately?
It's a fair question to ask. And certainly Shapiro has been criticized before for not taking leadership. And very famously during his first budget process, he kind of washed his hands of it after this deal that he supported on school choice fell through. He said it's up to the House and the Senate to figure it out. And I think that was widely accepted as kind of abdicating his responsibility there. In years since, he's been a lot more, while he says that they all need to come to the table, he's been a lot more forward about saying that he's helping that process and helping lead those conversations. He's certainly saying that now that he's come to the table. And, in Pennsylvania, I should clarify, because we're at 100 days without a budget now. And that's being complicated by the fact that there's a federal shutdown and the fact that perhaps we both state and federal government at this point seem to be in the same exact place as far as negotiations go. It's just nothing's happening. And that is a very dangerous combination when you look at the agencies and the local governments that depend on both the state and federal government to operate. I mean, you have counties that are running out of money, you have school districts that are running out of money, and that has a very real effect on taxpayers every single day. So you really do want somebody who can guide that compromise. And so far, Shapiro has had a hard time ever since he became governor. And you have to wonder, will that come back to bite him in the governor's race? I'm sure when it comes to policy things like that, it's a lot that's a lot harder to get voters to be really fired. Well, I shouldn't say it like that, but people don't wrap their mind around state politics in the same way that they do national politics, right? Even though they are so intertwined that people really should be following from the ground up. However, will this state level debate stick to him the way other things would stick to him that have a more national appeal, particularly the fact that he's been very pro-Israel in the past, or that he was going to be Kamala Harris's running mate or was very close to it. These other things that, nationally speaking, we would get a lot more attention and concern from voters. So we'll see. He certainly would never be as polarizing as somebody like Trump. But then again, I don't think that he would ever try to be that way for the Democrats. I think that he is going to maintain this air and this message of we need to work together. And it's just, when we say we need to work together, who does that really mean? If Democrats are in control of both chambers, to Senator Ward's point, then he just has to work with them, and that's a lot easier, right? To give them what they want. But if he's got divided government or he's got straight Republicans, then there's going to be a lot of concessions, and he can't be digging his feet in as much as he may be able to do right now because he can take cover behind House Democrats.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it would certainly be an interesting litmus test. If we can get Pennsylvania together, then
fair enough.
That is a good resume.
Fair enough.
Well, thank you so much. We will, of course, continue to follow the Pennsylvania budget. We'll keep following Governor Josh Shapiro as we always do. And we will continue to follow the New Jersey governor's race and see how that turns out. All right. Thank you. You can follow all that and more at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.